Let's check in with Joseph Lindsley in Ukraine.
In the past 3 days, Ukrainians have destroyed 6 Russian fighter jets. So while the world still dithers and maybe sometimes not focused, the Ukrainians are continuing.
Joe. Little fucking Joe Lindsley.
Joe Lindsley is quickly becoming an American treasure in broadcasting. U2 is in Las Vegas at the Sphere, and the other night Bono paid tribute to Alexei Navalny during the cover of Crowded House's Don't Dream It's Over. Bono led the audience in a chant of Navalny's name and spoke about Ukraine's fight against Putin's invading forces. Bono said, "To these people, freedom is not just a word in a song. For these people, freedom is the most important word in the world." Joe Lindsley in Kyiv. Joe, that's something you've talked about many times here. How are you today?
Bob, good afternoon from Kyiv. It's calm and quiet here at the moment, which is always, as we get sort of distracted or, there's all kinds of other news. It still is extraordinary to me that here we are, February 20th, almost approaching the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. And after last year's brutal, terrible, cold winter with no power, electricity, or heat, it's snowing a little bit today. We've gone through many months of winter with no successful Russian attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. And it's pretty remarkable that the fact that I think part of it's the Russians realize that even if you did try to freeze the Ukrainians out and they had to live in the dark and the cold, they weren't going to quit. And that sort of spirit is echoed in what Bono was saying there, as you quoted him. And what I appreciate about Bono's remarks, and your staff had sent me this story in the Wall Street Journal by the chess master, grandmaster Garry Kasparov, who's a native Russian. Very few voices have tied Navalny to the story of the Ukrainians. When you read most accounts, it's all about Navalny, and without talking about what the Ukrainians are doing. And in fact, in this piece in the Wall Street Journal today, Garry Kasparov said, in the discussions at the Munich Security Conference, Navalny's murder threatened to overshadow the daily death of innocent Ukrainians at the same hand, at the hand of Putin. And I was very glad that he made that point because, Kasparov understands this as a native Russian, as one of the few very clear Russian voices against Putin and in favor of Ukraine. He knows the chess game and the poker game of what the Kremlin is doing, and how there's not many accidents. When it comes to the timing of Navalny's death, was during the Munich Security Conference, and indeed, in the past several days, Navalny's death has overshadowed stories from Ukraine. For example, we could have headlines about how it's cold and it's wintertime, and yet where are Russia's infrastructure attacks on Ukraine? A sign of success. We could have stories about how Russians have deleted that Donbass city of Avdiivka. It's gone. It's been erased. Instead, there's such a focus on Navalny. And we even, as Kasparov pointed out in his op-ed in the Journal, we have President Biden and European officials in response to the death of Navalny, have very strong statements saying, "Oh, more sanctions." But the question is, after 2 years of full-scale invasion, how could you possibly have more sanctions, right? I mean, if you were so moved by the Ukrainians and their resistance against tyranny, you think that we already would have every possible sanction we could imagine, and yet there's not. And it's the death of Navalny that is, because it's a popular trending topic, that is spurring people to say, "Oh, time for more sanctions on Russia." And meanwhile, you have, children in Kharkiv going to school in the subway system because they can't be above ground because at any moment missiles could hit. You have soldiers giving their lives every single day. And what's often forgotten is that those soldiers, most of the Ukrainian soldiers are not professional, but, they were civilians before February 24th, 2022. And they're only for, they have to be soldiers if they want to have freedom now. But they are really civilians, and that's what they intend to be. And so much of this gets lost in this conversation about Navalny. And as Kasparov said, the West seems intent on duplicating the apathy of the Russians. And what Kasparov says so well in that story in the Journal is that the Russian people also failed Navalny. Navalny was a voice willing to be critical of Putin. Ukrainians are very critical of Navalny. I mean, he eventually sort of came down on the side of Ukraine, but he was in favor, at times of taking Crimea from Ukraine. He was in favor in some ways of Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008. But still, he was an opposition voice, and he led a rally, for example, in Moscow in 2011, when people were rising up against the regime. And Kasparov says that it was he put it very eloquently. He said that in one sense, Navalny was the last gasp of Russian society, a Russian society that failed Navalny, failed Russia, and failed the world with its apathy. A man of optimism and action in a country of nihilism and inaction. And here's where this is sort of the political theory that we see playing out in this war, because Russians, by their refusal to take to the streets every day and resist, and yes, even face bullets from the regime, they allow the Kremlin to unleash hell and war upon the world. And even if you go back and read the great Russian novelist Dostoevsky, who was really one of my favorite writers before all this time, his book Demons describes sort of this disease of apathy and nihilism taking over Russian politics in the middle of the 19th century. And that is such a contrast with Ukraine, as Kasparov and a few others point out. Ukraine, I mean, 10 years ago from this very day, Ukrainians, they had been in the main square of Kyiv, just a few blocks from where I'm talking to you right now, protesting, and the protests got bigger and bigger and bigger. And sometimes when we hear stories about the Euromaidan protest, we're told it's because Ukrainians wanted to be part of the EU or be more aligned with Washington, and it wasn't that. It was that they didn't want to be governed by anyone besides themselves. And in these I know so many people who were there in the Maidan, in the main square. They were left and they were right. They were all different religions, and they were united in this sense that after a century of Sovietism, after centuries of being ruled by other people, this was their moment to be free, and they stayed in that main square. And today, February 20th, 10 years ago, was some of the worst violence. The regime. It was the last day. No one knew this for sure. It was the last day that the pro-Putin regime was in power. And they sent the secret police, the Berkut, into the main square. At least 77 of these protesters were killed. And at the same moment, you had European leaders and American leaders, trying to move in and negotiate. They were Donald Tusk, who was prime minister then, and now he's prime minister once again in Poland. He thought he convinced along with EU officials, convinced the Yanukovych government here in Kyiv to agree to hold some elections in the summertime. And the people said, no, we're not buying that. If we don't change now, it's never going to happen. And so this is the opposite of sort of the apathy we see from the Russians. And people were taking trains and buses from cities all over Ukraine, especially in the West, to come here to Kyiv because they knew this was the moment to stand, even as they knew people were getting killed. And I heard the story in Lviv that word leaked out that the secret police in Lviv were going to block the highways to Kyiv. And so as soon as the word spread, it was some internal leak, people in Lviv got in their cars and they drove to the secret police headquarters and surrounded it in their cars, nothing fancy, just prevented the secret police from leaving their headquarters. And so this was the depth and how widespread the movement was. And I wanted to share with you this clip of the people singing the national anthem 10 years ago this week. They were wearing hard hats. They had built barricades. You can hear the smoke bombs of the secret police, and already people had been killed, and still the people stood there singing their anthem. And it'll take us to this moment of what it means to really resist against tyranny, just listening to this music.
Yeah, it's like Kasparov said in that Wall Street Journal piece. Navalny might still be alive if his countrymen showed the same courage that Ukrainians have.
Indeed, but this is, I think, the key perspective shift is, Ukraine, as I said yesterday, Ukraine is a nation of Navalny's. I mean, every single day here, people are resisting, whether it's those students in the subways in Kharkiv. Think of all the people in places in eastern Ukraine that could easily be living in Spain or living in Europe as refugees, and they're here. Yeah. That's part of the resistance. So I hope this doesn't get missed and obscured, especially as this 10-year anniversary of Ukraine's Maidan, which shows people that it can be painful, but it is possible to make a stand and live in freedom. And one other piece of good news that gets missed. In the past 3 days, Ukrainians have destroyed 6 Russian fighter jets. So while the world still dithers and maybe sometimes not focused, the Ukrainians are continuing diligently to try to stop this threat.
Joseph Lindsley in Kyiv. Thank you, Joe. Talk to you tomorrow.
Thank you for introducing Ukraine on your social media pages. That's very important that much more people can get more information about the situation here and how everybody can help Ukraine to stay stronger and to save all the world.
Что он сказал?
Well, which side are you on?
На чьей ты стороне?
Come on now. Oh, which side are you on?
На чьей ты стороне?